Hello, welcome back to Math Time with Professor Prime. And I am your host, Professor Prime. Today we're going to talk about math and Dragon Ball. The focus is going to be on power levels and power scaling. And these two topics, they fascinate me. And I got to imagine it's the same for you if you clicked on the video. And I know it's true in general because as a fandom, we are collectively obsessed with the ideas. We have been since the inception of power levels. So, with that in mind, I am going to get into some spoilers in this video, so I wanted to give that heads up before we get into it so you can decide whether or not you want to watch it. And with that being said, let's get into it. So, with power levels, or battle power if you prefer, they are an idea that Toriyama, the creator of Dragon Ball, introduced in the Z portion of the manga. And the idea being they convey something about fighters. It was a way to show, the strength of fighters when compared to one another. If, you had a character like Goku who's, very, very strong, and Piccolo who is comparable, and this is at the start of Z, then you get someone like Raditz coming along and he sees their power level and he's like, oh, well, why are they so weak? You get a good idea. You can measure that, but then it gets more interesting. Then it gets more nuanced because as you progress, like even early on, both of them, right? They can concentrate their energy and perform some pretty devastating key attacks, and their power levels rise as a result when they're doing that. And that's not something that a lot of people who are using the scouters to measure power level anticipate. For them, it's something that's stagnant, and I find that fascinating. So you can use numbers to get information, but you can also use them to trick up people. And later on, you see plenty of fighters, notably from Earth, hiding their power levels, suppressing it, and that tricks people. It also allows them to allows them to hide, and I find it fascinating. When you get down to power levels, they're a plot device. And they're a particular plot device that I find interesting given my background. And here's why. When it comes to math, it's not just what we do in the classroom, right? It's the why. With math, it's meant to make our life easier, right? We're trying to find ways to talk about what's going on in the universe. We're trying to find ways to talk about the past, the present, the future. We're trying to make sense of things. And with power levels, it's no different. We're trying to make sense of things. And I find it interesting because it also allows you to, say that you need to keep context in key. Because, you might get like a lot of statistics thrown around, but you got to put them into context. And I think power levels demonstrate that sort of idea very well because when you look at power levels, it's like, yes, they give you the numbers and you can make all sort of extrapolations out of those numbers. You can do some solid data analysis and you can draw some conclusions. Now, from what we see in that universe, it kind of is spot on. But as we see from the fighters from Earth, that could be deceptive. The numbers don't tell the whole tale there. Context is key. And so I find that interesting. And so you see power levels throughout Dragon Ball Z, but considering how long it is, they don't last as long as you think. So by the time you get to the Namek Saga, things start to get kind of unruly. Um, but let's pull back a little. So in the beginning, right, of Dragon Ball Z, let's just stick with Goku and Piccolo for a second. Um, you know, at their base, without powering up and using a powerful energy attack, they're around 330. With Goku having a slight lead on Piccolo, and with Raditz, his power is well over 1,000. At that point, it's tough to find accurate sources on just how powerful he actually was. For some reason, I got it into my head that it was 1,200, but I've seen other sources that say it's 1,500. But either way, he's got them beat by leaps and bounds. But when they power up, let's say you use a Kamehameha or special beam cannon, that puts the power levels of Goku and sorry, Goku and Piccolo closer to him in those moments. And then to bring Gohan into the picture for a second, he's like four at that point. His ki is unimpressive, but he gets his rage boost, and all of a sudden he could do some solid damage. His power level is well over 1,000 when he hits Raditz. And so my whole thing is just that all fascinates me because power levels do give you information, but you got to put things into context and you got to know something about your opponent. It's not enough to just have those base numbers because yeah, they tell you part of the story, but not the whole thing, and that's interesting because whenever you're using math, the numbers are not just enough in a vacuum. That's fine, but when you actually put it into context, when you actually put that analysis used in the real world, you gotta keep context in mind. And it goes on both ends. If you're someone interpreting data, you need to keep context in mind. If you're someone who's like hearing data, it's the same thing, right? Because people can mislead you. The data can be misleading. You can take it and maybe your tools are right, but how it's interpreted and how it's presented is a different story. And I think power levels demonstrate that perfectly. Now to move forward, once you get to Vegeta, right? That's where it gets interesting because let's say Goku for instance. So we know that his base was at like a 300, right, or so when he fought Raditz. Now he did his training in the other world when he died, and he comes back and his base is over 8,000. Now that's interesting because that's a huge leap, and this is part of the problem with power levels. Now it's still manageable there, and you can still get an idea of things, but it gets kind of crazy because at this point, right, Vegeta is stated to be 18,000, and though we don't see, I mean, like we don't really hear Nappa's power level. In the Dazinchu 7, it says it's 4,000, and you can take that with a grain of salt, but that's an official guidebook. So if you're rolling with that, that gives you an idea of things and why Goku utterly curb stomped him. But that being said, you can see that Vegeta, definitely has a huge advantage. But Goku has the Kaioken, so he can raise his base even higher, and he can go up to 3, and I think he does 4 at one point during that fight when they did the beam struggle. It's been a while, but I think that's the case. And either way, Kaioken can be kind of confusing with how that works. But the idea is, he closes that gap and surpasses Vegeta in that beam struggle. And then you get like Vegeta's transformation into the Ozaru. And in the guidebooks, it's said to be like a 10 times multiplier, but you don't really see that within the series. But if we're going on that logic, that used to confuse me when I was younger and I saw that information because I was like, well, then that would make him 180,000. But the thing is, by the time he transforms into the Ozaru, he is thoroughly weakened. It's not clear like how much his power level would drop because he couldn't access his full power at that point. But the idea is like, yes, he's still going to get that boost, but it's not going to be as impressive. But it's definitely enough to curve stomp like everyone involved, and Goku's like burnt out on top of that. But he loses that fight. So then you get into the Namek era, and that's interesting because you get to see more of what I've been saying about power levels. Because yes, they impart information, and for most people, it holds. They can see their base, and you're not going to get much more than that base. But with the fighters from Earth, they can mask their ki. They figured out how to do that, and so if someone's scanning, they're going to think they're weaker. And that's if they're able to detect them at all. But if they're trying to be sneaky, they're trying to be stealthy, and they raise their ki, then people can notice that. And I think that's interesting because you have like Frieza and his soldiers, and none of them knew how to sense ki naturally, so they had to rely on the scouters. Whereas with the Z fighters, and this is where I find it kind of funny, they've been doing power scaling the whole time. They're not going to have the exact number, but they get what the number is measuring. They get what it's about. So they're doing some quick math in their head, whether they realize it or not, even if they comprehend that or not. And that helps them get away with some things. And Vegeta, he learns pretty quickly. He picks up on all that. And so with the Namek Saga, Frieza Saga, whatever you want to call it, that's where power levels largely come to an end. And that's fascinating to me. And for me, I feel like it's because it was no longer an effective plot device, and Frieza ends up being so monstrous that he completely breaks the scale. Because remember, when they're entering this saga, um, Goku, he was like recovering in a hospital, but before that, his base was 8,000. And he does do some training that like heightens that significantly while he's going to Namek, but and that's crazy too, by the way. Um, but Vegeta, he gets a Zenkai boost at the beginning, and he gets several throughout that arc. But in the beginning, he's 24,000, right? So that gives you an idea of things when you compare them to Frieza, who in his first form has a power level of 530,000, which is insane. Absolutely insane. So he already starts off stupidly broken. And the gap between those characters and him is staggering. But they close it and it gets crazier because Frieza in his second form had a power level of over 1 million. In his third form, we're not actually sure, and I don't think there's actually an official number that's like listed in the Daizenshu 7, but a lot of people surmise that it might be 2 times what his power level would have been before, so maybe he would have been over 2 million. But whatever the case is, it gets crazy when you get into like Frieza's final form or his true form, and when he's fighting Goku, his power level is like listed to be 60 million at his 50% form, and in his final form, and that's crazy. And Goku pretty much matches that when he comes out, because a lot happens in that saga. But when he fought Frieza for the first time, his base is like 3 million, and he hits him with a Kaioken times 20. So they're about even, and Frieza though still of course has more power, and Spirit Bomb thing happens and all that. Goku eventually goes Super Saiyan. You know the deal. But with that in mind, like the numbers that I'm quoting are from the Daizenshu 7. And so when you have Frieza full form 100%, his power level is listed as 120 million. Goku is listed as 150 million. And so if you look at that and where things started when they introduced the power level, it's so insane. Because remember, Goku in his base, when he was fighting Raditz, was a bit over 300. He then jumps all the way up to 150 million in his Super Saiyan form at the end of that particular saga. And then, like after that, they when Trunks is introduced, his power level is measured at 5, but he's very, very much suppressing it. And then as you go forward, they really stop using them because they're not reliable. They no longer get what they want across anymore, and the power levels are so high at that point anyway that it's hard to gauge. And so, with all that being said, it gets even more fascinating because you get into the idea of like the Super Saiyan forms and multipliers, because the multipliers are again, this information is taken from Daizenshu 7, and they talked to Tioran about some of this. The Super Saiyan form is said to be a 50 times multiplier, so 50 times the base, where Super Saiyan 2 is 100 times the base, and Super Saiyan 3 is 400 times the base. And those are some big numbers, and so the power level is definitely skyrocket. And here's the thing. They train, right? They train in their base, like the Saiyans in particular. They train in their base, and their base level rises, and that just increases drastically as the series goes on. And so you have the multipliers on top of their increased base, because like even when Goku came back from fighting Frieza a year later, his base right there is going to be way stronger than the base that he had when he fought Frieza. And you don't have to even go far to see that, because during the Saiyan saga you see their power levels skyrocket in their base forms. That doesn't stop. They just train harder and harder. And so it gets crazier and crazier. And could you imagine keeping track of those numbers after a while? It just gets ridiculous. But moving on, they did try to bring something back in the Buu saga called Keelys. And They were mentioned briefly. That's about it, and they didn't really do much. Um, and I gotta say, the Blue Saga definitely hard to scale things. It was a confusing mess, at least on my end. Um, some of that's due to translation. And for Cell Saga, you at least still had a decent idea of things, but they didn't use power levels, so you kind of had to go off of just where you knew the characters were. Because I think going off of feats is inconsistent in Dragon Ball, but like I can see why people definitely use those when they start the power scale. And speaking of that, at the power levels, you have to do something if you want to get an idea of character. So you power scale. You look at characters and how they compare to one another. You, in some cases, look at feats, even though I don't think that's reliable. And I do think it just gets inconsistent, and characters suppress themselves left and right, so it gets massively confusing. Some people get huge boost, especially the Saiyans. They get a lot of Zenkai boost, although that does seem to slow down as time goes, or they at least stop talking about those crazy boosts as much. Um, but anyway, this is starting to get long. Um, but by the time you get to Super, it gets crazy. And for the record, if someone was curious about like GT, I mean, you have Super Saiyan 4 in there, you have the Golden Ozaru, but they don't really talk about that much. But it's hard to scale things in there too. But moving on to Super, the first two arcs were adaptations of the Dragon Ball Z movies, the last two Dragon Ball Z movies, Battle of Gods and Resurrection of F, where in those movies they introduced two forms. In Battle of Gods, they introduced Super Saiyan God or Super Saiyan Red, if you prefer. And then in Resurrection of F, they introduced Super Saiyan God, Super Saiyan, or Super Saiyan Blue, if you prefer. I'm sure most people do. But anyway, they're hard to scale because it's unclear how they stack up to the other Super Saiyan forms. Because if there's multipliers for those, they're never mentioned, and you don't see them in official material that's reliable. And so you're kind of left to roll around with that. And then some people got confused by different interviews and different statements. And some people for a while, and maybe even some people now, think that Super Saiyan God is stronger than Super Saiyan God, Super Saiyan, or Super Saiyan Blue. And that's not true. Otherwise, why would they use Super Saiyan Blue? But anyway, Super does get hard to scale, and I know a lot of people try it, but like I don't. I just enjoy it for what it is, and I try to get a good understanding of what's going on. So I don't try to measure feeds and all that stuff. I do try to kind of go off of what I see though, and sometimes that can be confusing. And by the time you get to the end and you're dealing with the tournament of power, it gets massively confusing because people are suppressing because they can't go in for kill shots, but people are getting mad power boosts, and then you got to deal with Ultra Instinct, which is stupidly broken by the way, and who knows what their actual power levels are. It's that power level is. It's hard to scale. But yeah, then you get to Broly, and that's hard too. And that brings up fusion because you got Gogeta in that movie, you have Vegito in both Z and Super, and it's hard to say how they stack up. Just that they are massively powerful than the two warriors that compose them, and that's true in fusion in general. And then you got characters like Gohan that'll come along, and he just gets mad power boosts left and right. And by the time you get to Super, it's unclear how he stacks up to people. It was a point of confusion when he fought Goku right before the tournament of power. But the way I took that is that he got up and he got as strong as Blue, but he still was weaker than Kaioken. And then even within the tournament of power, people were getting boost left and right. And so most of those characters are way more powerful coming out of that than they were coming into it, which is crazy because it's 48 minutes. But wow, this got to be a really long video. But my whole thing is just that power levels were a way to indicate that a character is stronger or weaker than another. And it can be used for deceptive purposes, and I feel like it's a cautionary tale on taking values for what they're given. Oh God, that sounds awful. It's a cautionary tale about taking numbers and values at face value. Okay, that didn't sound great either. I've been talking too long with this. Okay, so power levels are a cautionary tale not to take numbers at face value. Context is key. Information can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. It can be presented in a lot of different ways. Context is key. Be careful. And with power scaling, you know, it's us trying to make sense of things, and that's the whole point of math. And so we try to say, oh, well, this character is X amount of time stronger than this character, or we could say that this character is stronger than this other character because of this feat or that feat, and that's all fascinating to me. In any case, this is now, I think, my longest video. That was not the intention. I thought I was going to talk about this for probably like, somewhere between 8 and 10 minutes, and yet here we are. So if you stuck it out and you watched this entire video, thank you. I hope it was interesting to you, and I hope you find math a little less painful, because if you're a fan of power levels and power scaling, you probably don't hate math as much as you think, or at least you don't hate why it's useful. Just saying. Professor Prime out.